Catholic University of Leuven to Professors Polifet and Berven, who developed this work in a set of tools and a huge research project looking at and analysing Catholic schools and wiping out their Catholic identity. And they came up with, I think there's a thing here that shouldn't be there. They come up with this grid, and along the bottom is the solidarity and openness of each school. That's the axis here. And then up and down, it's the Christian Catholic identity. And so what their thesis is that you are starting from, we were told about the Catholic school as, if you like, the fortress Catholic subculture. And that's what describes traditionally the monologue school up there. So minimal solidarity, it's more or less a closed shop, but it's very strong identity. And what they've said is that as schools have developed in the countries they've looked at, schools have moved away from that, and they've moved in different directions. So, of course, they could lose their openness and also lose their Christian identity. That's less common in the work they did. But schools moved across, becoming more open, more likely to be in solidarity with others. But the Christian identity was the question. Now, their theory says that the ideal place for a Catholic school to be is up in this corner here, with maximum Catholic identity, but also maximum solidarity. And they call that the dialogue school. One of the great things about this is it's developing language to talk about these things. And so you've got the monologue school, the colourless school, the dialogue school, and the colourful school. And I think some of the schools that and the examples that we heard about earlier from James Arthur were talking about where he was suggesting that some had moved towards this sector here, being a colourful school. And the Belgians are quite good because they were analysing these various schools and saying, and of course this school shows some colourful tendencies, talking about a lot of social solidarity action, but not so much Catholic identity. So I thought I'd share that with you because it seems to me it gives us a bit of a language in which to talk about these things. So before my 5 minutes runs out, I want to say one other thing, because I think the other thing that's important in the political debate is language. And often we find that others are very clever at defining languages so that the premise is already set before we enter the discussion. And when we do that, we've almost lost before we start. It's an uphill struggle. And so I'd like to issue an appeal to you to do one thing, if you can, practically for Catholic education, and that's to reject the term faith schools. Why? Because the research shows, I think, very clearly, and I'm sure you know this from your own anecdotes, that if you ask, it's the images that are conjured up by different language. If you ask the general population what they think about faith schools, the reaction starts negative. Generally, they're a bad thing, they ought to be done away with, there ought to be fewer of them. If you ask the general population what they think of church schools, on the other hand, starts off positive. People think, oh yeah, church schools, they're really good. Perhaps there ought to be more of those. Now, 99% of schools with a religious character, you wouldn't tell it from the media, 99% are church schools. Okay? And of the 1% remaining, the vast majority of those are the Jewish schools that have been with us for a very long time and have a very similar journey actually to us. So, by all means talk about Catholic schools, church schools, or if you want a phrase that is actually based in law, other than which is not, faith schools is not based in law, use the term denominational schools, which that covers all types of schools with a religious character. But if you can do that and help us to shift that language, then that would be one great thing that you'd be able to do for Catholic education. I'm over my 5.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, as I promised, I'll open up immediately. Are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to? No? Oh, yes, there is. Yes.
Another piece of language that I think we could move away from is about deliberate. So we talk about delivering education like it's a fancy milk. And actually it isn't. You know, that you're not about in the business of delivering, you're in the business of teaching education, not delivering them.
I entirely agree. I hope we don't say that. I'm not conscious, but I think that the debate about language, I pick one, but the debate about language is a very important one, and we ought to have that discussion more widely about how we position ourselves in terms of language in a way that's much more understood by people.
I think there is a very secularisation is very apparent in the language that is often used around education, and it's very easy to say you can't mirroring back the education. The language that is used towards it rather than saying
Yes, I agree with you, and I think that what we've got is there's a balance to be drawn, because we have to be careful about adopting secular language, which changes with the wind anyway, but we also have to be careful about using language that's so theological that even most Catholics don't understand it and get the wrong impression then. So it's a really interesting and difficult balance, but I entirely agree with you.
Certainly, the idea that education is a good, not a commodity, I think that would resonate very strongly with most people. And then we can get away from all the managerialism about delivery, efficiency, and so on. Great, thank you very much. Let me ask Rob then. Rob Flello is MP for Stoke-on-Trent South. And Rob, you also have 5 minutes or so.
Marvellous, thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me along. I feel incredibly underdressed on this panel here, but my penance for it is hay fever has kicked in, so that's what happens when you dress in a summer fashion. So if you see me snuffling and coughing and choking, don't worry, just let me get on with it. I think that just a couple of other things to preface my remarks. It's always dangerous, of course, speaking at this time of day when you haven't heard all the speakers and all the keynote speeches, and you also don't know how. You can guess how well educated the audience is, but you don't know their specialisms. So when I trip myself up and say things that are completely wrong and irrelevant, then I look forward to the questions where you can put me right. The other thing I'm just going to preface my remarks with is I feel I've got quite an interesting angle on this, in that I've only been a Catholic for about 7 or so years, having previously been an atheist. So I come at this with a very interesting take on where we get to, but I'll hopefully develop that over the next 4.5 minutes. So where are we? I think in terms of, and can everybody hear me okay? If you can't, wave at me. Okay, fantastic. In terms of, I'm going to pick up that last point Paul's reeling away, because I think our own attitude is part of the issue as well here. But I'm just going to mention a couple of quotes to really get things going. The first is, I did a little bit of trawling through and looking at mentions by the Conservatives, by the government, about faith schools. And I use that word deliberately. And there's very little, actually, so I'm going to be really interested to hear my colleagues kind of take on some of this, that I could immediately find. But one thing that did jump out at me was about the issue of the new free schools, and of course this issue about the whole long list of new free schools that were opening up a couple of months ago, but actually the number or the lack of number of Catholic free schools because of the issue around non-Catholic places. And I'll return to that. Then, sadly, when I looked at my own side and some of my own mentions, and my good friend and colleague and immediate neighbour, Mr. Tristram Hunt, who is the Stoke-on-Trent Central constituency MP, just 2 things jumped out at me from what Tristram was saying. The first was when he was talking about Ofsted. He said, we have particular concerns that Ofsted is not allowed to inspect religious teaching in faith schools, which jumped out at me for 2 reasons. One, again, the mention of faith schools, but also the issue about wanting Ofsted to get their paws on religious education. And then the other issue, which in a way jumped at me even more, which was, again, something that was built on what Tristram had said, that was in the Labour Party's policy guide, which said that under Labour, faith schools will remain. However, it cannot be the case that schools are allowed to act as islands, either around ethnicity or religion, not cooperating or forging partnerships with other schools. And I think, he says, sniffling, I think what that shows, actually, is within my own party, there's a real misunderstanding, there's a real lack of knowledge about what it is to be a faith school, church school, denominational school. And just to pick up a little bit further on that, in terms of our attitude, I think when we we have to be very careful about language, and as politicians, you know, our stock in trade is language. But I think we also have to be very careful and very conscious that we don't deliberately use language to try and hide ourselves from some of the assaults of the secular and humanist world. And that actually, if we are comfortable with calling things faith schools, then we go back and reclaim that piece of language. I think the danger with going into denominational schools is, yes, it's very technical and very much the legislation, but most folk will say, a denominational school, what's that? What is one? They're much more comfortable with talking about church schools, which is great, rather than faith schools. Now, I think there's also a little bit of, for me, and again, this is probably where I'm going to show a little bit of my many years of ignorance built up, is in terms of what Catholic education is for. And I'm aware that you've had some very good keynote speakers about this. And is it about an education for predominantly Catholics, or is it about an education for everybody, but with Catholicity at the heart of it? There's a contradiction already starting in there, because if we're going and saying, you know, well, no, church schools are about educating everybody in the area, but we're doing it because we're Catholics, we want to make sure that children get a good education, then you allow people to say, well, hang on, why are you arguing over 50% places in the schools if all you're looking at is education? And if you're saying, no, we want these to be good Catholic schools, then again it puts you slightly at a contradiction, puts us slightly at a contradiction, when it comes to sort of trying to say, no, we're very inclusive, we want to work and move across. That then brought me into thinking about, well, actually, why do so many non-Catholics, and I include myself that when my daughter was little, I was quite happy as an atheist to send her to the local Catholic school, because I thought she'd get a great education. Yeah, how's that for bizarre? And it's so true of, you know, in my constituency, a lot of Muslim families send their children to local Catholic schools because they want them to get a good religious-based education. They might take them out of the bits that they don't like, but they like the fact that they're in a good school with that ethos. And I think then there's also a danger, which I've seen, where actually there's sometimes a tension between Catholic ethos, good Ofsted results. Oh, hang on, there might be a bit of a dilemma here, a bit of a tension. What's going to go out the window? Well, we've got to get the good Ofsted results. So really sorry, Catholic ethos, you're just going to have to take a back seat. And I've seen that happen in schools, and that's for me is a huge worry. Just conscious I'm rapidly running out of time and doing the classic politician's trick, forgive me for that, of talking way too much. I think for me the real issue here is actually about the secular, humanist, I used the word in my original notes, aggressive secular, aggressive humanist, but actually then decided to put that word aggressive in brackets, because actually I'm not so sure it is just about aggressive secular, aggressive humanist approach to things. And again, some of the things that jumped out at me really were, oops, he says throwing his papers at Paul, where, you know, there's Oliver Cam, Times leader, writer and columnist, not too long ago, matter of about a month ago, said there should be no more publicly funded faith schools. In a pluralistic and diverse society, it's an invitation to ignorance for children to be segregated by a characteristic that is, for all civic purposes, totally irrelevant. He does go on. I won't repeat any further of what he said. Again, there was a Labour List blog of Labour List readers. This was back in June of last year. Following the so-called Trojan horse scandal, debates have emerged about whether that state funding should be done for religious organisations, whether it should continue to fund faith schools. 72% of Labour List readers said the state should stop giving any money to faith schools. And so forth. So just to conclude, I think really there's an issue here. I think the aggressive, but perhaps not so aggressive, secular humanist coalition of different viewpoints would actually like to see an end to church schools, would like to see an end to religion, and any excuse to get rid of religion from our everyday lives is great, and if they can get rid of it in schools, fantastic. If they can get rid of it in any other part of our lives, they'll cheer that as well. So their agenda is all about just getting rid of religion, and obviously for them, I think quite often getting rid of it in schools is a great starting point. But also there's a danger with politicians that actually when we talk about faith schools, what we really mean is Muslim schools, and we just don't want to say that. And actually what we are concerned about, and I think the way the government brought the things around British values, and this whole stuff around British values, which time stops me from talking at great length on, is, you'll be pleased to know, is that actually the issue there is politicians are concerned about what's happening in faith schools, don't want to say it because they don't want to be accused from all angles. So rather than find a better way of shaping that debate, they've done two things. They talk about faith schools and they brought in British values. And with that, I'll shut up. Thank you.
Rob, thank you very much. Now is your chance to quiz Rob, including about the things he hasn't yet touched upon. So, yes, please.
Rob, thanks for that. Just one question I know you were pushed for time, but you're hurried by one important point. And that is, we've been speaking about what Catholic education is all about. There's been a lot of expression and time given to inclusivity and community and tolerance. And what it actually means. You started yourself by saying what a Catholic education actually is, and you said in your brief 5 minutes that non-Catholics in Catholic schools can opt out of certain things, and you moved on quickly. It's just a question, really, because we've got politicians in front of us. Surely, when a parent chooses to send their child to a Catholic school, then they're sending their child for a Catholic education and all that encompasses. A parent can't make their child opt out of PE or maths or anything like that. So if to us it's as much as an important part of the curriculum as anything else that we educate, not deliver, then that they're striking at the heart of the community when a child or children are actually marginalised for a period of time during the school day. And it's just a question where we stand on it, because I genuinely don't know, because fortunately, it doesn't happen in the school. But just legally, where do you stand on that? If you actually say, no, you've signed up to this Catholic school, it's not a cafeteria approach, you can't take what you like and leave what you don't. It's everything.
Yeah. My personal view on it is that if you sign up to go send your child to a Catholic school, you sign up for the whole piece, and you don't opt out of anything. You can't opt out of anything. I think what tends to happen in practice is that you get, and again, this is what I've seen anecdotally, is you'll have a head teacher that doesn't want to rock the boat, doesn't want to make waves, doesn't want to cause problems, or is more concerned about Ofsted results, and actually by keeping that child in the school and keeping the parents happy, they'll get good results from Ofsted. So if you don't want to send your child along on that particular day, or there's several things that come to mind, but just picking a couple of things purely out of the air. If there's a play being organised in the school and the child has been part of the rehearsals and all the rest of it, but when it comes to actually performance of the play, that child is missing, which I gather is something, again, I've heard anecdotally quite common. Where does the school stand on that? But also with parents going up to head teachers and just simply saying, my child will not be attending this particular part of the curriculum, and head teachers having both the confidence that perhaps the school governors, the Catholic Education Service, the diocese, whatever, are standing with them to actually challenge that. And I think whatever we might say in terms of legislatively or indeed prescriptively from within the church, the reality is that head teachers are quite often making decisions that are different to that for a whole host of reasons, but quite often very similar reasons. So it's a bit of a rambling answer.
No, it's very interesting. Thank you.
I'll take one more and then we'll move on to John. Yes, please. No, behind, and then there'll be time again after John's presentation as well. Yes?
Just to come back on that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, the idea that people have chosen Catholic school for its particular character and the urban environment. But in reality, obviously, many people don't live in urban environments, and also because the pressure for school places, particularly in cities like Leeds, for example, parents are being sent, their kids are being sent to schools that are maybe very low down the list of priorities, or things on the list of priorities. There's a case recently in the press of several children being allocated to Sikh preschool, for example, and that was being run with a religious character. They haven't chosen it, it was the available school today. Now, to what extent can we assume, therefore, in this current sort of high-pressure environment in terms of admissions, that parents have actually genuinely chosen a Catholic school? Also, bearing in mind the the difficulties associated with the results. And parents feel under great pressure to choose schools with excellent Ofsted results, and that may well be a local play school. So to what extent they're chosen Catholic character, and to what extent they're chosen a local outstanding school.
Really good point. I think just by way of reply, a couple of observations. I think firstly, it's interesting that even the sort of the secularists, the humanists are using the fact that parents are pretending to be Catholic or pretending to be Church of England to go to the good local school, suggests that there is more choice rather than enforced choice, if I can put it that way. And then just, I didn't get a chance in my 10-minute, 5 minutes, just to mention, there was a survey done on the 15th of May suggesting 1 in 8 parents fake religion to get kids into faith schools. A survey commissioned for ITV found that 12.6% of parents have pretended to practice a religion they don't believe in so they can get their children into a reputable faith school. So this suggests to me that there's a whole host of things going on. You're absolutely right. But I think equally, if parents were coming forward and saying, we want to send our child to a really good school, we don't want to send them to that particular church school, faith school, whichever you want to call it, then I think there would be more pressure on local authorities, more pressure indeed in terms of setting up faith schools. The difficulty with any conversation like this is you immediately have to generalise, but of course, you know, the reality in the ground is that some places, rural areas, for example, will have a completely different set of pressures to predominantly urban Stoke-on-Trent, for example.
Okay, shall we move on to John, and then I haven't forgotten the lady in the middle, but I think now's the time. So, John Stevenson, MP here in Carlisle, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm not a Catholic, and I didn't go to a church or a faith school. I went to a comprehensive school in Aberdeen. And I think my starting point as a politician and indeed as an individual is that what really matters is good quality education for all. I believe that it's in the interest of parents, quite rightly, schools, society, politicians, and indeed the individual. They may not realise it when they're at school, but in later life they will look back and think, I had a good education and that set me up for the rest of my life. How that good education is delivered, it can come in church schools, faith-based schools, state, academies, free schools, grammars, the private sector. It comes in a variety of different ways. Again, in my view, I think what matters is that those schools are successful. I believe in diversity, I believe in competition, and I actually think that's what drives up standards and improves the education of our country. And indeed, I think education matters, and it probably matters even more today than it has ever done, because we live in a far more complex world. I think the skills that we're going to require as a society in the future will demand better education. And I look at myself, it was funny during the election campaign, I was called a posh rich Tory solicitor living in Great Corby. And I thought to myself, well actually I went to state education, a state school, then state university. But what mattered and what gave me the chance in life to become a solicitor and yes, to probably earn a reasonably good salary, etc., was the fact that I had a good education. And that set me up for life. So I truly recognise that that is really important. But therefore, what is the role of church schools, faith schools? As I understand it, 1/3 of all schools are in fact considered to be faith schools. They're often high performing, and I do genuinely believe that they bring something extra to the curriculum and to the lives of the individual. And I'm never quite sure if this is a true story or not, but under the Scotland Act, or Education Act 1908, the state provided funds for Catholic schools. And then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher in her wisdom decided that there should be, parents should have parental choice. So all of a sudden those Catholic schools became very popular with the Protestants. Why? Because there was a good education provided at that school. But I do think if church schools, faith schools are to be successful, they do have to be open, transparent, and offer a rounded education. And I think your question today is, are they under pressure? Is there political pressure on them? I say my honest answer is no and yes. Under my government, I don't think there's any intentions to radically change the regime or to put any additional burdens or restrictions on faith schools. But nevertheless, I don't think there's any active intention to do anything to promote them in any particular way. But I actually think there's an underlying issue for church schools that goes beyond just the school and education. And actually, that's the churches themselves. I actually think to a certain extent churches and society have been a little bit in retreat. So we're not talking about secular society and humanists. I think to a certain extent they've been pushing back churches as well. And that links into faith schools and how the link between church and faith schools and how they present themselves to the wider society is important. And I think the churches themselves have to turn around and say, actually, we've got to promote ourselves, be more assertive, and argue the case much more than they have done in the past. And the same will apply for faith schools. They bring something, I think, very good and positive to our society. It's interesting, everybody wants to change their religion almost so they can send their children to the good local school, which invariably is a faith school. So that demonstrates the schools are doing something right. And what we need to do is say, sell yourselves and say, actually, we are doing the right thing for the education of our children. And yes, that happens to also include, in your case, the Catholic faith. And I would actually finish quite simply where I started. The most important thing, I think, is making sure that the children of the future have the best possible education. And I personally believe that church schools, faith schools, have a very big role to play in that, because I think they make a very valuable contribution to that education.
Thank you very much, John. Are there immediate questions to John? Yes.
So yeah, just a question. I was wondering how the Conservatives intend to marry the kind of the proclaimed kind of instinctive commitments and liberty to freedom and things like this, with what turn out to be quite pernicious influences of definitions of extremism, definitions of British values, which don't seem biologically in essence. They don't seem co-created. They kind of on high, delivered down to other schools, which we have to cope with, even when actually, I'm quite happy to admit that it might be unintentional. That puts us in a difficult position in certain places, for example. I'm wondering how is there a way that Conservatives can kind of untie that knot?
I don't always think the argument's got to be levelled at, that it's for the politicians to do the arguments. I actually think you've got a role to play. Actually, you've got to argue your case as well. I think politically, my party, and many of us individually, are probably very sympathetic to churches and faith schools. But you've also got to present the arguments too and argue your case to galvanise us to support you. I think probably right now the Conservative policy is broadly neutral. And that's not necessarily good from your position, because I think the others in the argument are trying to push the barriers towards less faith schools, less public, the state paying for those schools. I mean, interesting, Charles Clarke, I think, a former Labour politician, recently was saying that the requirement for a church or
assemblies.
Pardon?
It was religious assemblies.
Yes, religious assemblies. Yeah. His argument is that actually they have no place in schools. So you can see they're already presenting that argument, which is contrary to what you would like to see. So I actually think it's not just the responsibility of politicians to put forward arguments, it is actually the responsibility of churches, schools, etc.
Okay, I think there was a question from Ross, right, to Rob early on.
Sort of harking back, I think, to the previous speaker. Forgive me if I've sort of slightly kind of lost my train of thought slightly, but I was just wondering, in the political sort of sphere, field, do we problematise religion and associate it only with faith schools? And are we therefore putting faith schools, which we include church schools, at a disadvantage? So I was just thinking back to much of the Trojan horse problems. If my memory serves me right, they were not faith schools.
None of them.
Some of the latest radicalisation of the 3 young girls who kind of went off to Syria, that was not taking place in a school of a denominational religious character. And it seems to me that I don't know if it's our politicians or our media, but we seem to problematise religion and sort of situate it in the faith school camp. But religion happens in all schools. The religious education that is of a broadly Christian character and collective worship that is of a broadly Christian nature is mandated by our government for all schools, not just for the church schools. So I just wonder where is this sort of coming from, this problematising of religion and and sort of situating it just in the faith school camp.
Yeah. If I may, I think anybody could have quite easily been forgiven for reading the papers and switching on the TV at the time of the Trojan Horse scandal problems and believing that these were faith schools, that these were Muslim schools. Whereas actually, they were state comprehensive schools that had this problem. And actually, I think there's probably very, very strong argument to say it couldn't have happened in a denominational school, whether that's a church school or indeed a Muslim school, because actually, in those schools there is a much more structured approach to RE, to the way that religion is done in those schools, and particularly, Paul's probably better placed than I am to talk about the structures that are within the Catholic education system. But to read all the coverage, to see the coverage, to listen to the radio news, you would have not believed that for a second. And I think that all is because it was very, very convenient to tie into, again, going back to this sort of secular agenda, to try and make the UK a secular country rather than a country of many faiths, but predominantly a Christian heritage. And it was therefore something that was misinterpreted deliberately to create that impression, so that people can be told, well, look how terrible all these religions are, look at the misery they cause, the wars in the Middle East at the moment, that's all because of religion, that's all because of God, and this whole approach of saying the problems of the world are down to religion, rather than actually, no, the problems of the world are not down to religion. Sometimes people's interpretation of religion may be very convenient, and they may use it to cover their real activities, but actually, again, it just fits into that agenda.
More questions and comments to John, or indeed to other panellists, or just generally? Bob?
I just wanted to bring in something else that I approached myself, I omitted it from my own presentation, and it's the word Europe, but just give me 2 sentences to amplify what I mean by that. When Her Majesty the Queen spoke in Berlin recently, I actually found it, I was really quite taken by surprise, I found it incredibly moving, this old woman addressing not really the European Union or the North Atlantic Alliance or even maybe Europe, but maybe something that used to be called Christendom, and kind of remembering at her great age how this continent, an immense cost of blood and treasure, seen off to titanic ideological enemies in the 20th century, bent on its destruction. And I just wonder, therefore, if you see, in the most expansive sense, a European dimension to this conversation, because conversely, my friend and colleague Liam Gearan at Oxford University has argued that these secularising forces have deep roots in the Brussels imaginary, and that an active European civil religion is being promoted through our European institutions, quite designedly to eclipse confessional attachment.
That'll be an interesting argument for the Eurosceptics to take up in the forthcoming debate.
Yeah.
It's an interesting point that you make. I actually think the debate about British values, etc., frustrate me, because at the end of the day, we should look at our history, our custom, our traditions. We are still a Christian country. All our institutions have developed out of Christendom, etc. And yes, we are a tolerant society, and certainly other religions, I think we should fully embrace them and take them into our country. But culturally, I believe we are still a Christian country, and I find it frustrating that we actually have to define what British values are. We should just intrinsically know what those are, and you sort of grow up with them, and you just sort of absorb them. And I think defining them is dangerous, because then you start having an argument over exactly what they should and shouldn't be.
And also it could be divisive actually at a point when more cohesion is possibly needed. So, for instance, to say that common sense as a value is already to put in a category that doesn't actually correspond to its reality, which is that it's a habit, it's a form of outlook, it's not something which you can codify.
No, absolutely not. And
It's not like the French Revolution, the 3 principles that you can just enunciate, because it's just not at that same level.
It's a bit like our constitution. Our constitution is unwritten, but it grows, it develops, it absorbs, it just copes with change. And I think our culture is coping with change, and our values are like that. But I think fundamentally we are still a Christian country, and we should be proud of saying it.
Yes, Paul, and then Rob.
Couple of things. Responding to your question, I think that my own experience of some of the Brussels goings on and the way in which the European Union works is that I think that I was saying we were in a different position here to say France, and I think that the French laïcité and that sort of understanding has very deep roots in parts of Europe and does have, I think, a disproportionate influence on Brussels and the various institutions of the European Union. And if you look comparatively, and we always moan a bit about our own system of state funding of schools and all of those kind of things, but actually we've got a very good deal. And if you compare it to the way in which it's done in different countries across Europe, I think we've got one of the best. And that's reflected in the numbers. Catholic schools make up, as is said earlier, 10% of the schools in this country. They also make up 12% of all Catholic schools across Europe. Okay? Because, with the exception of a few countries where there are very heavy percentages, there's huge swathes of Europe where there are there are effectively no Catholic schools, pretty much, and certainly no state-funded Catholic schools.
I was just going to a couple of observations. I think if I remember it rightly, when Europe was first sort of established, it was kind of almost with a Catholic push. But I think since then, absolutely, it has sort of bled away to a more sort of secular view of the world. So I think just on that one particular point there, I think there is certainly that issue. There was something else I was going to pick up on, which was, I think, I agree that we are still broadly a Christian country, but my mind just goes back to I think Wilberforce's practical view on Christianity, or practical guide to Christianity. One of the things in there, if I remember rightly, was where he didn't use this exact language, but his take on it was that most people in this country, 200 years ago, whatever, their view of Christianity was half-remembered Sunday school lessons and what they thought Christianity was about. And I think that probably applies equally today, that actually most people's idea of Christianity, unless they constantly and practice their faith and have extremely good priests in Mass on Sundays, preaching very well and explaining things, which of course all of us do, I'm delighted to say. So I think unless that's the case, actually I think for many Christians, people who would consider themselves to be Christians, even if it's just broadly in name, their view of Christianity is half-remembered lessons and what they think Christianity should be about. So whilst I agree with you, I think there's also perhaps a little bit skimming across.
More questions or comments? Oh, sorry.
Can I just pick up two things? First, British values. I just came back from a residential group of children away to New York, and we were at Clifford Tower. And I was talking to them about what happened with the Jewish community in Clifford Tower. And one of the children there said, that's not a very good example of British values, is it? And this is the problem with British values. It's where we pick the British values from and who's in power in decide what British values are. So that's something else that we need to look at. Also, talking about Catholic schools in Europe, we have a large amount of Polish Catholic children who come to Newman School. However, the primary schools are Brook Street, Norman Street, within the community. Talking to their families and talking about the Polish community and the church, the schools over there, they say that they don't need to go to the schools because it's done in the household. So a lot of these issues with the Catholic schools and abortions, because in the families, when it's increasing in the family here, the wraparound care that the Catholic schools are offering is taken over from the role of the family. We pick children at 7 o'clock in the morning and let them go at 6 o'clock at night in our primary schools. So that is where the faith is. it's not actually known anymore.
Does anyone want to?
Do you think
Sorry.
teachers now are under pressure with inspection? I must teach British values. I must have British values in my lesson. Do you think teachers should explicitly teach British values?
To a certain extent, they should express the history, the culture, the customs of our country. For example, our democracy and our history, etc. I do actually think they should, because I think people should understand why we are where we are now as a nation. The difficulty with defining things is it can be very prescriptive, and as you rightly say, it becomes divisive. So I think we have to be very, very careful about that. But I do actually think we have an obligation to teach people where our country has come from, how it's developed, why it is where it is. Because it's taken centuries to get to the point where I think we are still a remarkably tolerant country, and probably one of the most stable places in the world to live, even now.
Can I pick up both of those questions in one answer? One short, pithy answer. You've got the measure of me already. I think there is a huge danger in teaching British values for exactly the reason that you said. Because, in fact, I can't remember how the conversation came about, but I was having a conversation about 2 hours ago about Britishness and how we had a certain reputation in the world. And I said, well, actually, if you go back not that many years, you can look at situations, for example, in Cyprus, where British troops behaved in an appalling way. They captured the Greek Cypriot rebels, they captured them in a cave, and they set light to the cave. Is that a British value that we should teach? So, your pupil was extremely on the money, I think, with their observation. So I think you can put the pin in our history at a whole series of times. If you were being particularly uncharitable, you could say that actually many of the conflicts and problems we have around the world today have, at some point or another, had the stamp of British colonialism that's drawn lines on maps and said, right, that's two countries that are divided, and that's caused a huge amount of conflict. So you could actually say that we haven't got a fantastic reputation historically for having the highest of standards and the highest of values. But again, I would agree that we have to teach the history, and you can do it in a way that says, these are some great things that we did. These are some things that actually our behaviour was really appalling. And we have to always remember those lessons from history. And I think one of the problems is that we don't remember the lessons of history. We forget what happened yesterday, and we make the same mistake again tomorrow. So I think we have to teach that in a historical context. But I'm very wary about teaching British values, which of course is effectively a requirement. Simply because whose values are they? Are they the government of today? Are they, who knows that the government of tomorrow might not be a fascist dictatorship type of regime? I mean, hopefully it won't. But you don't know what's going to happen. So as soon as you set in train that this is what's going to happen, that is a real hostage to fortune for the future. Well done to the pupils that spotted it. I think just the other point about wraparound care from 7 till 6, I mean, I think that's creating a whole host of other social problems that will come back to bite us in 15, 20 years' time anyway. But I think, again, you're right. I think in other countries where, particularly Catholic countries, where you've got Catholic communities within those Catholic communities that live and embrace their faith and really celebrate their faith day in, day out. And I think there is a danger, you see it all too often, and sometimes I'm very guilty of this as well, that God gets put back in the box on Sunday lunchtime and comes out again on Sunday morning. So I think there is a real issue there.
Paul and then the lady.
Yeah, just picking up British values, I think that the current list that is prescribed shouldn't really cause anyone too much of a problem. Certainly in Catholic schools, I think you can be quite relaxed about that. I think that the problem with it is it was a mechanical reaction to a political problem, not anything that had any great depth or vision to it, or any kind of philosophical basis. So I do think we need to be perhaps worried about the idea of a government prescribing the values that we must all hold and teach. I do think that we might want to have some kind of communal discussion about what the list might be, if there were to be a list. And I think it's quite interesting the label British values. One can argue this both ways, but a recent conversation was quite amusing where the group was setting up a French school in London because there's a large French community. And of course, in order to do that, they have to sign up to British values, which was quite amusing for them. But of course, when they looked at the list, they didn't have a particular problem with that. I think that that values are less taught than imparted, and that's part of the general process of education. And as I say, I don't think Catholic schools should be anything other than quite relaxed about. If they're doing Catholic values, if they're imparting Catholic values, then I think we'll easily cover the list. And it's just worth remembering in that context. And so slightly, again, I mean, I understand what you're saying about bad examples, but actually, we're celebrating this year, in this country, the 800th anniversary of one of our greatest exports, the Magna Carta and the ideas around that. And we mustn't forget that not only was that formed in a Christian country, but actually, if you look at the history, it's glossed over in many areas. The church was fundamental in putting those values into that document. They come from our medieval theology, canon law, philosophy. And if you want a good introduction to that, the Theos think tanks produced a document, Magna Carta, and its Forgotten Christian Roots, which is an excellent introduction to that. So that's, I think, if we are in that space, then I don't think we have anything too much to worry about the current list of British values.
Of course, what about Northern Ireland? Britain doesn't include them. It's the United Kingdom of Britain and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Right, so the lady and then the gentleman. I'll take those two maybe together, and then I give our panel a chance to respond because we are only 8-9 minutes from the end. So please.
Just a quick observation about you concerned about teaching British values, which could be British history as well. Is that in my opinion, Catholic schools, church schools are best placed to address those because of our faith and our belief in forgiveness and the fact that we all make mistakes. And so no, we should be trying to invent it, and we should. I agree with Paul that we are in a positive place to address that because it's it's the way that we believe the world to be anyway. And so we are best placed to look at those and to embrace that and to not set the record straight, but say that people do get things wrong and we should forgive and we should move forward and remember. But yes, it does happen because that is used a lot as a weapon against British values and that kind of mention that what the Empire did and what Churchill did. And I think that we should embrace the fact that what we have in our church is that tolerance and that forgiveness and that acceptance that we do with things.
Sure, you're right, but there's two things. One, you can teach all of that as part of history, and the danger is the precedent that is being set by having a set of British values that is prescriptive and is mechanical. And that for me is probably, you're absolutely right in all the way you teach what's happening throughout British history, and you do it in a way that is explanatory and it explains and also looks into we make mistakes and forgiveness and everything. Absolutely spot on, couldn't agree more. But you can do that as part of a history of how you get to where we are as modern Britain. But as soon as you have a prescriptive list that says this is British values, you must teach it, and this is how we've come up with that list. It's the future is the problem. Future's the problem.
I don't agree with that list being held, but I think that schools will address those things. But like you say, it's intrinsic. It's very difficult to pin down at the beginning.
Well, that's the danger of putting it down in writing, and I agree with Rob. The British values of the 19th century or the 1920s are radically different from the British values of the 21st century. Who knows what they'll be in another 100 years' time?
We don't have enough play on saying that they're British values, so therefore they're right and they're better than
Singly, I'm British to write anything on paper anyway, and then say that. So, anyway,
very good.
About language, I wonder if the whole values thing has actually taken us down a route we shouldn't go down in the sense that it's framed and based in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Now, a Catholic must not look to about Christian virtues.
Yes.
We know what they are: faith, hope, charity, justice, fortitude, prudence, temperance. We can teach those, we can educate in those, and they will be enduring, and the values come and go every time and so on. I just wonder if the values things are one of those language things we often have. We should put our vocabulary and our wisdom for 2 millennia that says virtue is what
Which is really
I would totally agree with that. I think one of the things that the best of our intellectual tradition is actually to be quite precise about language and say, what's the difference between a value and a virtue, for instance, and be more precise about that. And I mean, somebody the other day pointed out, well, that list of British values, well, democracy is not a value; it's a political system. So actually, even then, it's inconsistent. And I agree with you. Values is used far too flabbily these days, and to move towards talking about virtues and encouraging the practice of virtues is probably a better way to go.
That almost sounded like the final word, but I just want to give all panellists the chance to say anything else they might want to say, because we are now just 5 minutes away from the end. So should I maybe do this in reverse order? Start with John. Is there any final reflections you would like to share with us?
It's an interesting discussion because I'm obviously not a Catholic. I mean, I've always admired the Catholic Church because I think the gentleman in the back talking about the beliefs of the Catholic Church, that you have sort of, this is what we believe and we will be absolute in those. I think that's a great strength of the Catholic Church. The education of our country, I think, is absolutely vital. As I said right at the outset, I think it's the education right across the board. In my view, it doesn't matter how that is provided, different ways of doing so. But the Catholic Church, the schools that you run, I think have proved to have been very successful, and I suspect will continue to be. And that demonstrates the strength that you do have. And that is a very, very valuable contribution to our society.
Rob?
I think I've probably taken up far too long with this session, so I'm just going to say, what a great place to end it on, virtues.
Good. I hope you don't mind me ending on a slightly frivolous note, but I wanted to react to something you said earlier, which I found very helpful, which was talking about the hierarchy of the wise and the learned. And it reminded me of a Mark Twain quote. And he said, "When I was 14, my father was so stupid I could hardly bear to have the old man around. When I was 21, I was amazed at how much he'd learned in such a short space."
Absolutely, great. So can I, before bringing this to a close, can I ask you to join me in thanking the three panellists, Rob Flello, Paul Barber and John Stevenson. And in fact, a formal end will again be far too continental European, so I'll leave that to Michael, because I think that will be more an invitation to join us for the benediction, I suspect.
Indeed. So yes, just very quickly, it's been a long day. Thank you so much for coming. I know some of you have travelled a very long distance to be here, and at least we've had wonderful weather, nice food, and lots of intelligent conversation. So thank you once more. We are now going to decamp to the chapel. You're more than welcome to join us. It'd be wonderful if you did. Saving that, I'm going to find a pub in about 45 minutes to an hour, and I probably won't move till around midnight. So if you're in Carlisle, probably the King's Head or something like that, by all means come and buy me an ale. That'd be wonderful. Okay. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much.